DEXA are gold standard for body composition. This stands for dual X-ray absorptiometry. I really wish this was sort of standard in our healthcare in the United States. I really think everyone over 40 should probably get one. Bone density for sure, right? This is really, really important. If you don't know what your bone density is and how it's changing, you potentially could get all the way to osteoporosis before you find out you've got a problem.
My name is Matt Kaberlein, and welcome to the Optispan YouTube channel.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. And today we are going to talk about body composition. And in particular, we'll talk about, what is body composition? Why is it so important that you actually know your own body composition? And then we'll get a little deeper into the tool that we use at Optispan, which is called DEXA, which stands for dual X-ray absorptiometry, and why it is that we really feel like this is the gold standard for assessing body composition. So this is, I would say, actually probably something that everybody over 40 years old, certainly over 50 years old, should know and get assessed if you haven't already. Your own body composition, and I'll get into the reasons why I think that's really so important. So we're going to do this in two episodes, and in today's part one, we're going to cover really what is body composition, what are some different ways to measure it, and then why DEXA. Why is DEXA really the gold standard here? And I'll show you a little bit of the kinds of data that come out of a typical DEXA report from my own experience. And then in part two, I'll be joined by Nick, and we'll really do a deeper dive on DEXA, the kind of data that you get. We'll go through our own reports and really try to help you interpret your own body composition information in order to be able to use that as best possible to improve your own health. So hopefully you'll join us for part two as well. So let's just start with the concept of body composition. Very basic. What do we mean by body composition? And really at its simplest level, what we mean is the stuff your body is made up of. And there are really several ways to think about body composition, right? So if you get sort of the most basic, you can think about the elements, the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, the nitrogen that make up 96% of your body by mass. You can think of it in terms of cell types, right? So there are, neurons in the brain and fibroblasts in the skin and myocytes in heart and muscle. Different types of blood cells, right? So that's another way of thinking about the composition of your body. There are also, of course, microbial cells within our own bodies. In fact, there are more microbial cells in our bodies than there are human cells. You can also think of composition at the level of organs, right? Liver, heart, kidney, lungs, or tissues, bone, skin, muscle, fat. So there are different levels of organization that we can think about when we talk about body composition. And this is actually probably a good time to do a very brief aside and discuss the difference between tissues and organs. So tissues are formed from cells that all have similar structures and functions, whereas organs are formed from a variety of tissues and they exhibit more complex functions that are necessary for life. So as an example, muscle is a tissue that's found in lots of different organs in your body, like the heart or the intestine, right? The intestine has to contract to move food along, or even the eye, right? To make your eye blink or your iris expand and contract. So this is the idea between tissues and organs. And again, just useful to appreciate these varying levels of complexity that make up the human body. So at Optispan, we really like to think about health from the perspective of a systems approach, recognizing that all of these levels of organization really have to function together to maintain health. And we do this by using different types of biomarkers to assess how close to optimal these systems are functioning. And so for body composition, we're really most interested in three tissue types: muscle, bone, and fat. You'll also sometimes hear fat referred to as adipose tissue, same thing. So we really want to know both how much our bodies have of each of these different types of tissue, and equally, maybe even more importantly, where those tissues are located. So this idea of positional distribution is critically important. Okay, so now let's think about the different ways, different tools we have available for measuring body composition. And so there are really a whole bunch, right? They can range from very simple like body weight to slightly more sophisticated like skin calipers, to even more sophisticated like a bod pod or hydrostatic weighing, or something called bioelectric impedance analysis. I'll talk a little bit about what that is. And then I would say at kind of the most sophisticated level is DEXA, right? This dual X-ray absorptiometry. And so very briefly, we'll go through several of these methods for measuring body composition, and then we'll jump into DEXA and talk a little bit about what it is and the kind of data you can get from it. Before we do that, though, let's just take a minute to talk about mass versus weight, because you'll often hear things like fat mass or lean mass. Probably everybody knows this already, but mass and weight are equivalent as long as you're on planet Earth, right? So if you were on the moon, your mass and weight would differ, but on Earth, they're the same. So what can we do with body weight, right? We're all familiar with the idea of getting on a scale and measuring our body weight, and that's going to usually come back in either pounds or kilograms, depending on what country you're in. So this is really the simplest metric of body composition, and it's the simplest because it doesn't really differentiate between the different kinds of stuff that are in your body. It just tells you how much stuff is in your body. And it's useful, right? We can use it to monitor change over time. We can use it to calculate things like body mass index. So probably everybody's familiar with body mass index. That's just the weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. And we use BMI for all sorts of things, right? In epidemiology, it's used to categorize people based on underweight, normal weight, overweight, or even obese. And it's a very powerful and useful tool, but it also obviously comes with pretty significant limitations, most notably that because BMI really only takes into account height and weight, again, it doesn't really consider what that weight is made up of. So we're all familiar with the idea that you could have two people who are categorized as obese, and one may be a power lifter or a bodybuilder with very, very low body fat, but because their body weight is so high compared to their height, they end up on a BMI perspective in the obese category. That person from a composition perspective is going to be very different than somebody who's obese and has a percent body fat in the 40s, right? And they're going to come with very different health risks. And so if we're thinking about body composition as a tool to assess health, BMI clearly has some pretty significant limitations. So I would say BMI is pretty useful at the population level. It's not very useful at the individual level, at least from the perspective of trying to categorize people based on their current health status or future health risks. So what we really want to do then is get beyond weight and start to look at what is the composition of that weight. What are the different types of tissues and how much of each of those are making up that body weight? And so kind of the next level of sophistication here are these tools that really break body weight into two components. And those include things like calipers or hydrostatic weighing or impedance methods. And all of these methods do this by basically estimating the percent of body weight that is made up of fat, and then everything else is put into this category called fat-free mass. And so again, it's useful to differentiate this idea between lean versus fat. So we'll often hear the terms lean mass and fat mass. So fat mass is just the weight of fat in your body. Fat-free mass is everything else, and that would include water, muscle, bone, vital organs, and other minor things that add to the total body weight. So lean body mass is technically different from fat-free mass, and that's because the lipids, so those are fat molecules that are present in things like cellular membranes, are included in lean body mass, but not in fat-free mass. Now, it's a relatively small amount, it may be as much as 3%, and I think these terms are often used interchangeably, so it's just worth knowing that they're not quite equivalent. Another thing that's important to appreciate, though, is that the majority of the fat-free mass or lean mass is water, actually up to about 60%. And in fact, none of the methods that we're going to talk about today for measuring body composition are actually able to directly measure the water composition in your body. And so that's why hydration state can actually cause some errors in all of these methods, including DEXA. And so the recommendations are to when you're doing repeated measurements with these methods to try to make sure that you are in a similarly hydrated state. So this can lead really up to about a 2% error in percent body fat if your hydration state is massively different. So with all of these methods, you will see the fat component typically represented as percent body fat. And again, that's just the mass of the fat or the weight of the fat divided by the total mass or total weight. So for example, if somebody weighs 160 pounds and then 40 pounds of that are fat, their percent body fat is going to be 25%, right? 40 divided by 160 times 100. Now, if you think about the same person, but they drank an excessive amount of water, so they are really excessively hydrated that day, and they weigh in at 165 pounds, that won't change the 40 pounds of fat measured. So their percent body fat would be calculated as 40 divided by now 165 pounds times 100, which is 24.2% body fat. So this can kind of give you an idea how, a small amount of error can creep into these measurements just based on hydration state. Now, it's not a huge amount, but depending on the body weight of the person, if this was a very light person, that extra 5 pounds could actually lead to more than a percent difference in percent body fat measured. Okay, so again, just useful to appreciate the impact of hydration state. Okay, so let's talk about some of the different methods for measuring body composition. So probably the old school method here is really skin calipers, which are really just kind of pinching the subcutaneous fat at various locations around the body. And then from that, using an equation, estimating the percent body fat. And so, the pros of this kind of method really are that it's quick, inexpensive, pretty much anybody can do it, doesn't require any specialized equipment. The cons, of course, are that, it really relies on consistent technique. And so I think it's very easy to get body fat estimates that are way off when using calipers if it's not being done by somebody who really has a lot of experience or knows how to do it properly. And that's probably more difficult than most people think. Of course, the other con, which is going to be true for many of these methods, is it doesn't tell you anything about the non-body fat components. You can estimate a percent body fat, but you don't really learn anything else. So there are some more precise ways to measure body fat. Those include things like hydrostatic weighing, which is submerging a person in a tank of water, or something called the bod pod, which is based on the same principle as hydrostatic weighing, except using air for the displacement. This is based on the idea of Archimedes' principle. And what that really says is that the upward buoyant force on an object immersed in a fluid is equal to the weight of the fluid that the body displaces. Okay, so in hydrostatic weighing, the weight of water displaced is determined by the size or volume of your body. Now, if your body was 100% water, right? Density of water equals density of water. You would neither sink nor float, right? You would just stay even. But our bodies aren't completely made of water. And it turns out that lean tissue, muscle and bone, are denser than water and denser than fat, and that causes you to sink. Fat is less dense than water, and that causes you to float. And so from that, it's possible to calculate with fairly high precision the percent body fat simply by comparing weight on land to weight in water. Because remember, in water, you have the competing forces of buoyancy, right? So this is actually a very, very precise method. The challenge is here, of course, it requires the specialized equipment. You've got to have a tank with rigged up to a device to weigh you in the tank. Of course, involves being fully submerged in water. It also requires that the participant expel as much air out of the lungs as possible in order to get an accurate measurement. And that can be difficult for some people to do. So the bod pod, same principle, except now we're using air instead of water to displace. And in this case, similar precision. You don't have to get wet. It does require still this specialized piece of equipment that probably very few people are going to have in their home, but some fitness centers do. And I've actually never used a bod pod, so I can't really comment on the experience itself. Like calipers or hydrostatic weighing, you really don't get an estimate of what it is that is making up the fat-free mass, but you do get a pretty precise estimate of percent body fat. And then the last method that we'll talk about before we get to DEXA is this bioelectric impedance analysis. So this works by running a small electrical current through the body, and then measuring the resistance to that current. And again, the reason this works, water, of course, which is a big chunk of our body composition, is a good conductor of electricity. Muscle actually has a higher water content and so has less resistance compared to other tissues, while fat has a higher resistance. And so based again on similar principles, you can, using mathematical equations, measure the impedance, the resistance, and come up with an estimate of percent body fat. So you can get these impedance scales for home use. They have 2 pads on them. You have to stand on them without wearing any shoes or socks so that the current can go through your body. It'll give you both body weight and an estimate of percent body fat. I've had an impedance scale for, a couple of years now. It turns out that at least my scale, not very accurate. So when I got my first DEXA, which I'll show you in a minute, my impedance scale was telling me that I was around 15% body fat. When I got the DEXA, I found out that number was really 21%. So I was a little disappointed. But nonetheless, you can get an estimate. And I suspect these things are pretty good at tracking change in percent body fat over time, maybe not so good at giving you the absolute measurements of body fat. And of course, there's going to be differences from manufacturers and things like that. Pretty cheap, about $50 for a low-end impedance scale at home. And then there's a fancier version of the impedance scale called an in-body that has both foot pads and hand grips, so you get electrical current from multiple different parts of the body. The in-body will give you some estimates of positional lean and fat mass. Again, we have one of these in the clinic here at Optispan. The accuracy is not as good as DEXA for sure, more variability, but it's certainly more accurate than the impedance scales that only have the 2 foot pads. The nice thing about the impedance tools is you can use them as frequently as you want to. They are completely non-radioactive, and so there's no barrier to using them even on a daily basis if you really wanted to. So for monitoring change over a short period of time, I think these tools can be pretty useful. You just have to recognize that there's going to be some error in the precise measurements. So that's kind of a recap of some various methods that can be used to assess body composition in sort of 2 dimensions, right? Fat and everything else. I would say the real limitations, aside from only getting information about those 2 dimensions, is that you really don't get any information about where the fat is located. And that's important because I think we've learned over the past decade or so that the position of the fat in your body is actually pretty important from a metabolic health perspective. So there's accumulating evidence that what's called visceral adipose or visceral adipose tissue, you'll sometimes see it abbreviated as VAT or VAT, is much worse than the fat distributed elsewhere in the body. So visceral adipose is the fat kind of underneath the abdominal muscles surrounding the abdominal organs. And you don't really get an estimate of visceral adipose, at least not one that in my experience is really accurate at all from these other types of body composition assessment. That's something that DEXA will give you. And we'll talk about, again, some of that data in a minute. Of course, as I mentioned, the other piece that you don't get that is also really important is what is the non-fat component made up of, particularly bone density. And again, this is where DEXA really shines because you will get very precise measurements of bone density from a DEXA scan. Okay, so DEXA, our gold standard for body composition. I've already mentioned this stands for dual X-ray absorptiometry. So there are X-rays involved. It's very low level, but there is some exposure to radiation. And that's really the downside of DEXA compared to some of these other methods. You wouldn't want to use DEXA on a daily basis, for example. The amount of radiation is really pretty small, certainly small compared to most other medical device levels of radiation. So it's maybe the equivalent of what you would get just from ambient radiation flying from Seattle to California. So not something to be worried about if you're doing this on a quarterly or semi-annual or annual basis. But it is a consideration when you're thinking about the pros and cons of these different methods. So How DEXA works is you will typically lay on a bed, and you can kind of think of it like an old school flatbed scanner. There's an arm that kind of moves gradually over you as you're laying on this bed. And there's an X-ray source that will shine low energy X-rays through the body. And then there's a detector that moves across the body and detects those X-rays coming out the other side. And the reason this works is because bone and fat absorb X-rays differently from other types of tissue. And so you can calculate then with very precise measurements, bone density, body fat, and then indirectly muscle mass or other types of mass from the X-ray absorption, okay? Again, the device does not directly measure water composition, so there is still this little bit of estimation there and can be affected by, as I mentioned, hydration state. So there's a computer algorithm that reconstructs the image from the X-ray and does all of these estimations behind the scene. So one thing I want to touch on, and this can be kind of confusing, is that there are really two different use cases out there right now, commonly for DEXA scans. Historically, DEXA scans have been for bone density. And so if you go to your primary care physician and they suspect osteoporosis or osteopenia, they will often refer you to a specialty clinic for a DEXA scan that will specifically look at bone density in specific regions of the body, typically the spine or the hips. And that's because that's where most fractures happen, especially in older people. So these are very precise diagnostic exams looking at bone density in specific regions of the body in order to make an assessment of osteoporosis or osteopenia. And I'll come back to how we define those terms in a minute. I want to differentiate that sort of diagnostic bone density DEXA scan from the more whole body composition DEXA scans that have become much more popular in recent years. And these are DEXA scans that are used really to assess bone density throughout the body. You do get positional information, as I'll show you in a minute. Body fat positionally throughout the body, particularly important visceral adipose body fat. And then muscle mass, again, positionally throughout the body. And these are typically not used in a diagnostic setting. They are used more as a screening tool so that people can kind of get a feel for where their body composition is at and then try to move towards a better body composition, a better healthspan trajectory. And it's my understanding not so much that these whole body DEXAs couldn't be used as a diagnostic tool. It's more that the companies that are offering these whole body DEXAs to consumers for legal reasons don't want to use them as a diagnostic tool, because that opens up all sorts of potential concerns about lawsuits and medical care and all of that. So it's just useful to understand that. And it's one thing to appreciate if you are referred to a specialty clinic for a bone density DEXA, you will very likely not get information on percent body fat or muscle mass throughout the body, because that's not what they specialize in. Their software is going to be calibrated differently and give out different types of information. Okay, so some of the information we get from DEXA that's important for health. Body fat percentage, again, we already talked about what that is. Visceral adipose tissue, which is the amount of fat in this visceral space, right, under the abdominal wall, surrounding the abdominal organs. The reason why visceral adipose is so important is that high levels of visceral adipose are associated with metabolic disease and high levels of inflammation. So one of the things that we've learned is that visceral adipose is particularly prone to giving off a lot of inflammatory signals. And I think that can contribute to much of the chronic inflammation that goes along with aging. And interestingly, you can find people, this is actually not so uncommon, you will find very lean people who have pretty low percent body fat, but who have higher than normal visceral adipose, who often are metabolically challenged, who may be pre-diabetic or diabetic. So I've heard this referred to as skinny fat phenotype. So it's just useful to know what your visceral adipose is. The converse of that is there are also people out there who have high percent body fat but low visceral adipose. And if you were to give them a glucose tolerance test or put them on a continuous glucose monitor, you may see that those people are very metabolically healthy, at least from that glucose homeostasis perspective. So visceral adipose is really turning out to be pretty important. You also get bone mineral density, as we talked about. This will typically be returned in something called a Z-score. So this is a statistical metric, and a Z-score really refers to the number of standard deviations an individual is off of the mean of the population. So if you know what a normal distribution is, you think about the shape of a normal distribution, the mean is going to be right in the middle. And what the Z-score is telling you is if it's a positive number, you are one standard deviation above the mean. And if it's a negative number, you are one standard deviation below the mean. We typically think of bone density as higher being better, right? Less likely to suffer from fractures or breaks, and lower being worse. So a negative Z-score means you're below the average for the population. Z-scores in DEXAs turn out to be age matched typically. So the way you will get this reported back to you, and I'll show you some numbers in a minute, the way you'll get this reported back to you as a Z-score will be normalized to your age range. So say 50 to 59, for example. So you're being compared to the population of people who are in a similar age category as you. And of course, because bone density goes down across the population with age, a Z-score of 1 for a 50-year-old would be a lower absolute bone density than a Z-score of 1 for a 30-year-old. Hopefully that made sense. So the other metric that is commonly reported with a DEXA scan is something called a T-score. And the T-score is meant to account for this age normalization that goes on with the Z-score. So a T-score tells you your relative bone density to a typical 30-year-old person. Again, based on standard deviations away from the mean. So a T-score of -1 would mean your bone density, wherever it's being measured, is one standard deviation below the mean of the population of typical 30-year-olds. The reason why that's important is because it's the T-score that is used to diagnose osteopenia and osteoporosis. So a T-score between -1 and -2.5 is diagnostic for osteopenia. A T-score less than -2.5 is diagnostic for osteoporosis. So if you have been diagnosed with osteoporosis, that means that on a DEXA scan, presumably at some point, at somewhere in your body, probably either somewhere in the spine or in your hips, your bone density was more than 2.5 standard deviations below the mean for a typical 30-year-old population, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So bone density we get from a DEXA scan, muscle mass we get from a DEXA scan, and then there are ways to normalize these things based on height. So one of the commonly used metrics that you'll see from a DEXA scan report is something called fat-free mass index. So remember, we already talked about what fat-free mass is. That's just anything that's not fat. And fat-free mass index is like the BMI to body weight. This is the fat-free mass to height, right? So BMI is body weight, height normalized. Fat-free mass index is fat-free mass, height normalized. And so fat-free mass index, it turns out, is actually a really good predictor of sort of whether a person is under-muscled or not. And again, having enough muscle is really important for a whole bunch of stuff. Functionally, obviously, to be able to lift things or move your body and function well, but also metabolically. Muscle is one of the most important tissues for maintaining appropriate metabolic balance because it's a really, really good glucose sink and can help you maintain appropriate levels of blood glucose. So FFMI, it turns out, is pretty important. We'll get more into that in episode 2. Okay, so now I want to finish up by just taking you through a sample DEXA report. This is a DEXA report from BodySpec. I'm actually going to show you my very first DEXA. So this is from a couple of years ago now. I was 51 when this DEXA was taken. And I really, really wish I had gotten a series of DEXAs in my 30s and 40s. I didn't. So if any of you are in your 30s and 40s, again, I'd encourage you to really consider getting a DEXA now. One thing to appreciate, so at least on the body spec reports, they will show you your intake weight. That's the weight you tell them when you fill out the forms. And then they'll also show you your total mass. This is the total mass that is calculated based on the image that's generated off of the DEXA, where you get your fat tissue in pounds, your lean tissue in pounds, and your bone mineral content, right? So the weight of the bone in your body. If you add those three numbers up, you will get, in this case, 193.6. So that was my calculated mass. So pretty close. I didn't lie about what I thought my weight was, as you can tell on the intake form. So don't lie on the intake form because you will get caught when the device calculates your total mass. Okay, so in this particular case, I mentioned earlier that based on my impedance scale, I was expecting a number in the teens. What I got was 21.3% body fat. That is calculated from the fat tissue in pounds. Same sort of equation I showed before, 41.3 divided by 193.6 times 100. That's how you get that percent body fat. And then, of course, the individual components broken out, fat tissue, lean tissue, bone mineral content. Okay, so what does it mean? What does that number mean? 21.3%. Is that good? Is that bad? Is it just right? Okay, so one of the ways to kind of assess that is you will be able to look at where your percent body fat fits compared to the percentile of adults based on age. And in this particular case, I don't know for sure. I should ask the folks at Body Spec exactly what population this is being compared to. This is actually important. It's probably more important for bone mineral density. So this is probably one of two populations that the percentiles are generated from. It's either going to be from NHANES, which is a large longitudinal study in the United States where data was collected on a whole bunch of metrics for thousands of Americans, including things like body weight, body fat, DEXA scans, a bunch of stuff. So percentile charts, most DEXA percentile charts that I'm aware of, at least in the United States, come from the NHANES data. This could be based on the percentile charts from Body Spec's own internal database, which it's my understanding is in the couple hundred of thousands of scans by now. But I think this is probably NHANES data. So in this case, regardless, if I look at my age, again, I was 51 when this was done. So you go down to men, 50 to 59, and then you go across to where your percent body fat fell. Mine was 21.4. So that puts me in the 20th to 40th percentile for 50 to 59-year-old men in terms of percent body fat. And we can guess, because I'm sort of towards the lower end of that range at 21.4, I'm probably sort of towards the lower end of the percentile range as well. I'll just say Body Spec has a new visualization tool on their website where you can actually drill down much deeper, but this is what shows up in the PDF that you get. Okay, so that kind of gives you a feel for how you fall relative to the general population. Now, what it doesn't give you is a feel for how you fall relative to optimal health. And that's a much more complicated question, and we'll get into that more in part two. But I'd say this is pretty good, right? Somewhere, probably around 21st percentile for percent body fat among age-matched men. It also gives you a report on how much of that body fat is visceral adipose. And remember, we talked about why that's important and what visceral adipose is. So in this case, I got a really good number, 0. It turns out there's some error bars around that number. And I think I'm learning that those error bars for visceral adipose are probably bigger than I might hope. So I actually did a repeat scan on the same day. And the second time, it gave me a visceral adipose mass of, I think, 0.4 pounds. So still pretty low. The target really, I think, is like below a pound, but you want to get that number as low as you possibly can. So just appreciate there's some error in these numbers, but it's good to know kind of where you start and then you can track over time. So in any case, whether it's 0.4 or 0, this is a pretty good number. And this says that I probably am in pretty good shape in terms of the amount of my percent body fat that's visceral adipose. And that has good implications for metabolic health. Bone density. So what you will get are positional data on bone density for head, arms, legs, trunk, ribs, spine, pelvis. And then you'll get a total bone density with a T-score and a Z-score. And remember, T-score is average 30-year-old, Z-score is age-matched, in my case, 50 to 59-year-old. They don't, unfortunately, give the T-score and the Z-score for the positional data. And again, going back to what I talked about before, the differences in the diagnostic DEXA scan for osteopenia and osteoporosis versus the whole body composition DEXA scan. I'm guessing that's why they don't give those Z-scores, but I kind of wish they would. Regardless, my bone density looks really good. So I have very, very thick bones. I think this is, proof positive that I have a thick skull. I think in my case, it also, fits with my experience throughout life. I have had many situations where I have had hard impacts on my body that potentially could have broken bones. And as far as I know, never have had a diagnosed broken bone in my life. So this probably can be explained, at least in part, by the fact that I have very, very thick bones. And so that sets me up nicely going into my 60s, 70s, 80s, as long as I maintain that bone density where I probably don't have to worry much about osteopenia or osteoporosis. But again, the only way you're going to know where you stand is to get a DEXA so you can actually get your bone density measured. And that's another reason why, I really wish this was sort of standard in our healthcare in the United States. Okay. So I mentioned before how osteopenia and osteoporosis are diagnosed. Again, just to reiterate, osteopenia is defined as a T-score between -1 and -2.5. Osteoporosis is defined as a T-score of less than -2.5. And the only thing I want to say about this is that I think that the population where the T-score is being derived from is pretty important here. Because if we're diagnosing a disease or a condition based on this T-score, that T-score could vary depending on the population from which the measurements were taken. So it's just worth appreciating that there's a little bit of potential wiggle room here in the T-scores that are being used. I'm sure the diagnostic clinics that are diagnosing are all using a standard set of percentiles, but as we may talk about in a future episode, I think there might be some reasons to question the quality of the DEXA data from NHANES, and that might, require perhaps a reevaluation of where these T-scores and these diagnostic thresholds are, how they're being set. Okay, so my recommendation then at this point really is, like I said, I wish I'd gotten a DEXA, probably one in my 30s, one or more in my 40s. I really think everyone over 40 should probably get one at least, every 5 years. And then in your 50s, maybe even more frequently than that. At Optispan, we try to get DEXAs for all of our participants annually. I personally, right now, am looking at 3 to 6 months between DEXAs because I really want to monitor my body composition. But I really think it should be standard medical care, bone density for sure, right? This is really, really important. And if you don't know what your bone density is and how it's changing, you potentially could get all the way to osteoporosis before you find out you've got a problem. Whereas if you catch that early, there's a lot of stuff that can be done to ameliorate the declines in bone density with age. So to me, it's just crazy that we don't actually do DEXAs for most people when they're in their 50s. And they're not that expensive, right? You can go to Body Spec and get a DEXA for about $50. So from a public health perspective, the benefits of catching bone density problems early and the cost there is probably much less compared to the cost spent on caring for people who are at very, very high risk of fractures, for example, as they get older. And then getting beyond the bone density, I think knowing your visceral adipose is super useful, particularly in terms of interpreting other data like blood glucose levels or A1C. And then knowing your muscle mass. Again, being able to understand if you are under muscled compared to where sort of you want to be or where your sort of optimal muscle status is, it's really good to know where you're starting from so you can actually engage and make changes to get to a more optimal health span trajectory. And again, my philosophy is you're not going to know if you don't actually measure it. And we've got a really, really good tool here for measuring these things. So again, consider getting a body composition DEXA if you haven't had one. Most of these places will have basic tools you can use to interpret your data, or I'd encourage you to watch part 2 of this video and we'll do a deeper dive into how we think about DEXA data. And again, I've mentioned body spec a couple of times. I don't have any financial stake in Body Spec. But I know the founders of Body Spec, Elaine and Roy. They're fantastic people, really like the company. And I've had great experiences with them. And so they have locations in Seattle, LA, San Francisco, Dallas, and Austin. So if you're in one of those places, you might want to check them out. But most big cities now will have body composition DEXA providers. And so you can go get one of these whole body DEXAs and, hopefully use it as a tool to start taking control of your own health going forward. So that's it for part 1. Again, I hope you'll tune in for part 2. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And as always, I hope to see you next time on the Optispan podcast.